So thank you, Michael, and certainly thank you, Mike, for the invitation to speak to today's conference to provide some background to the experience in schools. And while my talk will cover off on some of the broad implications for faith-based schools, I will specifically be referring to experiences of the schools which I represent, being the schools of the Anglican Schools Corporation. As Michael just mentioned, for background, most of my professional life has been with the Anglican Schools Corporation. I started as a brand new teacher in 1985 at Peninsula Anglican Boys' School, and apart from a break at St Andrew's Cathedral School, I then went on to lead Rouse Hill Anglican College for 20 years, and then for the past 2 and a bit years, the CEO of the Anglican Schools Corporation. To provide a bit of background about the corporation, it owns and operates 18 schools, mainly within the boundaries of the Anglican Diocese of Sydney. If you've seen a map of the Anglican Diocese of Sydney, it makes no sense. But it has the corporation has a mix of schools, from those that have an extensive history to those that have been just recently established. The corporation have also acquired a number of schools where they've faced particular challenges, mainly financial, which explains why we have 2 schools that we operate in the Diocese of Bathurst, in Orange and Dubbo. The objects of the corporation, as outlined in our ordinance, and Anglicans will understand that's law, the objects are to serve Christ by equipping students for his world through efficiently operating strategically placed Anglican educational establishments that, firstly, offer high-quality education within a Christian worldview shaped by the Bible. Secondly, that we communicate in word and deed the gospel of Christ to students, staff, parents and the wider community. And thirdly, that we're financially accessible to our local communities. So while we operate in diverse schools, each exists with a missional intent to communicate in word and deed the gospel of Christ to students, to staff, parents and the wider community. Each of our schools has an open enrolment policy, deliberately, so that the gospel reach is maximised. While Christian leadership in our schools is essential for the mission, not all of our schools operate with a full complement of Christian staff, though our employment policy does state that principals must seek to appoint as permanent or temporary employees persons of Christian faith and character and regular church attendance, provided that they are suitably qualified and experienced for the position. And they must only appoint as permanent or temporary employees persons who actually are supportive of the objects of the corporation. So what does that look like on the ground? Well, we're largely, a majority of staff identify as Christian, and they are active in their church communities. The minority of students in our schools come from Christian families, and we estimate that's somewhere in the range of 10 to 20% across all of our schools. Students come from broad backgrounds and cultures, of a range of faiths or no faith, but all encounter the gospel message each day through the teachings, actions and support of faithful Christian leaders and staff. Our schools are not churches. We have to navigate very carefully the matters that can cause tension, focusing first on the appeal and attraction of the gospel message of hope, and then gently and respectfully teaching about living as a faithful Christian according to God's design and purpose. I was so grateful for Max's words this morning, which reinforce that very notion. In order to do this well, We have to work well with our communities on relationships where mutual trust builds a capacity for respectful debate. In fact, we encourage such debate, as it's when we truly are able to respectfully wrestle with challenging issues that people can open up to different views. But this is sometimes where things do not always go well. Independent schools are no doubt easy media fodder. Within certain sections of the media, there is a view that independent schools are privileged, exclusive, and a drain on the public purse. Yet the majority of independent schools have low to moderate fees, and despite the claims of so many, receive only a fraction of the funding that government school students receive on a per capita basis. So when matters of faith, which are perceived by media as controversial, they are ready to strike with force, which will support their argument that independent schools should not receive a slice of the public purse. Like all organisations and individuals, we don't always get it right. We don't always necessarily read the room well, and there can be significant consequences for school leaders. In 2018, Anglican school leaders across Sydney signed a letter relating to our right to employ people of the same faith. The media struck, and they struck hard. The impact of this letter was very significant, and I accept that principals, including myself, naively signed the letter, not believing that it would be made so publicly available. And we paid for this, with an impact on our families as they were viciously attacked through social media. Some principals were even escorted in and out of their schools by police due to death threats. But the most damaging was the loss of trust from families and students, which means that the reach of the gospel message is compromised. The anger that is expressed from students, families, and community is so frequently misplaced, as they are relying on media bias and portrayal of matters rather than the true expression. This is so hard to undo. As a leader of a school or a sector of schools, this is challenging to manage, but it also impacts those on the ground. Our classroom teachers and staff who are fearful that the intent of their conversations and teaching will be misinterpreted and that they will find themselves in this ugly media spotlight or heated student anger or protest. So the result of this, without a doubt, is a loss of gospel opportunities. Our schools have had to work really hard to restore trust with their communities, but each time matters come up, such as the Australian Law Reform Commission review into religious educational institutions and anti-discrimination laws, we bunker down, being ever careful that we don't get Lucy Carrolled. That is named after the Sydney Morning Herald education reporter who has a particular way with reporting on independent schools. So let's look at the ALRC review. In late 2022, I accompanied Bishop Michael Stead to a meeting with the chair of the ALRC review, Justice Stephen Rothman. For background, Justice Rothman has an association with independent schools through the board of the New South Wales Association of Independent Schools, and he's also been involved in the governance of Jewish schools. While I was somewhat comforted by the terms of reference for the ALRC review, and that is, to remind you, to ensure that an educational institution conducted in accordance with the doctrines, tenets, belief or teachings of a particular religion or creed, firstly, must not discriminate against a student on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, marital or relationship status or pregnancy. We were fine with that. Secondly, must not discriminate against a member of staff on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, marital or relationship status or pregnancy. Okay. Thirdly, and this was the one that we actually thought, well, this is good, but it could be dangerous, can continue to build a community of faith by giving preference in good faith to persons of the same religion as the educational institution in the selection of staff. And our reasoning, if you do 3 well, then the issues that come up in the second could be resolved. We were particularly concerned about how the third of the terms of reference would be interpreted by the ALRC, and that played out. We provided many examples and reasons why it is important for faith-based schools to be able to preference the employment of people of that same faith across all areas of engagement in the school, to maintain the distinct culture of the school and to allow for effective pastoral care in line with the beliefs and values of that faith community. For instance, a secondary maths teacher is not only a teacher of maths, they are involved in the broader education of students, including pastoral care, in line with the teaching and traditions of the faith-based school. In many schools, this will also include leading prayer and faith-based teaching through homeroom or pastoral care group classes. Additionally, they're able to bring a faith perspective to the teaching of their particular subject area. In our schools, we refer to this as a Christian worldview. While I'm confident that Justice Rothman was able to understand our desire for preferencing the employment of persons of the same religion as the educational institution, I'm of the view that the Secretariat supporting this review held an alternative position that was ultimately provided in the review report, which was released on the 27th of January. The feedback period expired on the 24th of February, a period of just 4 weeks where schools were heavily involved in the commencement of a new school year. How often does that happen? Having said that, the level of response to the review report was very significant, and the initial timeline for the release of the final report was moved from 21st of April, to no later than the end of this year. I was speaking with Mark Spencer from Christian Schools Australia a couple of weeks ago, and his view was that the government will receive the report at the beginning of December, following the final sitting week of Parliament for this year. And then they have 14 sitting days to table the report. That could delay the tabling of the report to the back end of March, given that there's only 7 sitting days in February. It's expected that the government will want to have their preliminary response ready at the time that they table the report. And any legislative changes that may come as a result of the report are not likely to be presented until after the budget sessions in May. But it is important to note that it is a report to government, not a report of government. And there are strong indications that there is not much support from government for the ALRC proposals. However, we can expect a strong media push for the government to support the ALRC proposals with legislation. So it will be a test of the government's willpower. During the New South Wales election campaign, the then opposition leader, Chris Minns, made a promise to introduce a ban on gay conversion therapy in New South Wales, but at the same time maintaining a different stance to the extreme legislation that has already been in place in Victoria. And as Monica referenced before, conversion therapy in the past has referred to unethical and ineffectual therapeutic practices by mental health professionals, such as aversion therapy designed to change a person's same-sex orientation. Given that such practices have long since died out, the main purpose of the legislation in Queensland, Victoria and the ACT seems to be to deter mental health professionals from providing therapy to children, adolescents and young adults who experience gender incongruence in order to help them become more comfortable with their bodies. The chilling effect of this legislation will be to push many mentally unwell children and adults into making lasting changes to their bodies that they may later deeply regret, and which the evidence shows will often not make them happier or less prone to suicidal ideation. Under the New South Wales consultation paper, for a civil complaint, there is no requirement that any harm has in fact occurred. A person has committed an offence solely on the basis that they have provided a conversion practice, even if the complainant testifies that the practice was beneficial to them. In the pre-election campaign, the ALP candidates made following commitments. Any legislation to ban conversion therapy or suppression practices must not outlaw individuals voluntarily seeking out medical health, allied health or other advice and assistance regarding their personal circumstances. Similarly, Chris Minns promised the ban or the conversion ban has to be directed at an individual's sexuality with the correct purpose of suppression. Taking offence at the teachings of a religious leader will not be banned. Expressing a religious belief through a sermon will not be banned. And an individual of their own consent seeking guidance through prayer will not be banned either. Yet, in the consultation paper, the proposals would ban sermons or prayer, or an individually voluntarily seeking out assistance if these practices have the purpose of changing or suppressing a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. Even sermons in school chapel services, counselling and prayer, if they are deemed to have the primary purpose of changing or suppressing an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity, would not be exempt. And this includes heterosexual sex before marriage. If the complainant feels that the primary purpose of such a message is about changing or suppressing, even though it was not the intent of those delivering the message, it is enough to expose them to conviction. Any religious school, including board members, employees, chaplains and volunteers, that seeks to counsel a traditional understanding of gender identity, and wait for it, for example, by requiring that all students use bathroom facilities that align with their biological sex, will be in danger of criminal conviction. Such would amount to an attempt to suppress a person's gender identity. In Victoria, the legislation prohibits pastoral conversations and informal practices, such as conversations with a community leader, and teaching that states that certain sexual conduct and transgender practices are inconsistent with the religious beliefs of a tradition. We're particularly concerned about the effect that such legislation has on the relationship between a teacher and child, and indeed between parent and child. There should not be any interference in the relationship between parents and child. For example, the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission states that it's illegal if a parent or community leader, including a school leader, expresses that through long-term and consistent devotion in their faith community and avoidance and suppression of LGBTQ influences is illegal. Similarly, recurrent messaging that with faith and effort a person may live consistently with religious teaching is illegal as well. This is a case of government agencies actively interfering with the beliefs and teaching of a religion. As a result, parents, teachers and school leaders in faith-based schools in Victoria are fearful to speak into this space. At this point in time, the Minns government have not yet presented their proposed legislation to Parliament. Currently, they've allowed Alex Greenwich his moment in the sun with his own bill, but they have indicated that they will not support his conversion ban bill. They have, though, committed to introducing their bill this month with the hope that it will be passed by the end of this year. As Monica has demonstrated, across the country there is much happening with the review of state-based anti-discrimination acts, employment law and versions of conversion therapy bans. Faith-based schooling is under intense scrutiny, both at a legislative and media perspective. The media driving this process through extremist reporting. Even Section 83C of the Education Act is another way in New South Wales in which government can seek to regulate religious practice in independent schools. The link to taxpayer funding of independent schools is frequently touted as a reason for controlling the dialogue that takes place in faith-based schools, despite the fact that parents are flocking to our schools in their greatest numbers. The reality is that enrolments in independent schools across the nation are growing at a faster rate than at government schools, and most of this growth is happening in faith-based schools. Parents are seeking values-based education despite the negative media attention on supposed practice, such as alleged conversion therapy practices. The outcome of this intense media scrutiny is that meaningful gospel and faith discussions are hijacked by distractions relating to legislation or unfavourable media. But while we are immensely frustrated and while we need to campaign for justice, we should not be discouraged. Last night in church, we looked at the passage from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and I'm reading from verse 16 to 18. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. So despite the distractions that we continue to experience, we need to continue to be prepared to give an answer to everyone, to give reason for the hope that we have, and to do this with gentleness and respect. So I call upon you to pray for our school communities as they seek to continue to bring this message of hope to the many unreached students and families who are attending our schools. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I've been given the last spot as your lunch is digesting. I'm going to be talking about higher education, but I want to assure you that I'm not an academic, which may help a little bit at this time in the afternoon. Sorry to all my colleagues out there. I'm going to talk about three things with higher education. Firstly, recognising we've had the talk about schools, and most of the discussion in this area of religious freedom is around schools. Whereas it's important to recognise there are unique challenges that higher education face, which has significant consequence for the church and religion in general. That's point one. Point two, we'll be recognising that actually faith-based higher education provides avenues into current government narratives and social engagement. Number three, that there is an academic and relational capital through innovation in faith-based higher education, which actually can provide alternative solutions to the religious freedom problem. So those are the three things, just to give you, if you do fall asleep, there's your three, you can say you listened. I want to start with a story from back in 2018, and this was one that Mark Fowler mentioned, when after the same-sex marriage debate, there was an expert religious panel, the Ruddock Review, that was handed down. And as it was handed down, the media furor exploded. And this was on the misconception, deliberate misconception, that students and teachers at faith-based schools could and would be expelled or fired primarily because of their sexual orientation. So in response to this, Senator Penny Wong proposed a bill to repeal Section 38(3) of the Sex Discrimination Act and add a new section to 37 to exclude educational institutions from exemptions. The Morrison government, feeling the pressure to respond to the campaign, proposed changes and quickly introduced a bill into the House of Representatives which removed Section 38(3) but replaced it with some additions to a Section 7 which introduced the notion that educational institutions could, under reasonable conditions, conduct their institutions in accordance with their religious beliefs and doctrines. One of the main issues with this response, though, was, however, despite the vicariousness of who was able to define what reasonable conditions was, now and into the future, was that the Section 7 protections around students being able to uphold their beliefs and doctrines was only for schools. That is, primary and secondary institutions. It appeared that the tertiary sector and its need to be able to create communities of faith seeking understanding, intellectual understanding, and spiritual understanding had been completely forgotten in this legislation and were left with no protections in this area. I was on the ground that day in the rat maze that is Parliament House, which I had the honour of showing Mike Southern round when he first started this role with Freedom for Faith. And we saw the legislation and were shocked. We contacted the Prime Minister's office and the AG's office, only to be regretfully informed that it was now too late to change the legislation. So all of these religious freedom exemptions were about to be stripped away from tertiary. We'd just been forgotten. I had only started working in the role with Alpha Crucis University College for a few months prior, and by extension, the Australian Christian Higher Education Alliance, which is a loose coalition of 8 faith-based higher educational institutions, of which my new boss, Professor Stephen Fogarty, was chair of at the time. I'd worked in government relations for up to a decade at that point, but I had a lot to learn about this sector, which we don't really talk about, and this largely unacknowledged sector. So let me give you a little bit of history to faith-based higher education in Australia. St James College predates our public universities and was the first higher education institution in Australia. Begun in 1845 on the current St James Institute in King Street in Sydney, and close behind that was the University of Sydney in 1852. So faith-based higher education came in first. Sydney University was founded as a non-denominational institution, mostly by Anglican and Presbyterian laity. However, secular at that time meant non-denominational Christianity, as shown in the excellent book Reason, Religion and Australian Polity, A Secular State by Chavura, Tregenza and Gascoigne. However, over 150 years, theology and religious education in general did not survive within the I was trying to create a word around Leviathan that evoked this image of the public universities consuming all. But I'm not going to attempt it now, I've tried. This Leviathan structure within public universities, it didn't survive. It may have been part because denominations couldn't agree on what theology should be taught in these secular universities, so they shot themselves in the foot. But today, as far as I'm aware, there's only one public university that still teaches theology, which is Charles Sturt University. And even general religious studies units have been plummeting over the last 20 years. I did my undergraduate degree in 2006 at the Australian National University, where I was doing philosophy and religious studies as a major. And I was one day informed, in the middle of my degree, that the religious studies department had been dissolved. And now I had to figure out how to complete my major. So theology and religious studies in universities theology is almost non-existent. Religious freedom has been going downhill very quickly. So I'm wrapping my head around this sector, faith-based higher education. And what I was most taken by was the contrast to the schooling sector. So faith-based primary and secondary schools make up around 35% of the student population in Australia. In Sydney and Melbourne, in secondary schools, the number of faith-based and independent schools rises to almost 50%. Faith-based tertiary education, on the other hand, make up about 5% of the sector. 4% of that being the Catholics, ACU and Notre Dame. So 1% of Protestant, using that word loosely, higher tertiary education. Faith-based primary and secondary school, even though Peter did point out the inequality in funding, I think we've got more to gripe about, Peter. Because, and this is from my principal at my kids' school in Canberra, Emmaus Christian School. He said that about 50% of their funding is still from government for the school. And that's partly through the Menzies decision in 1964 and then the Dogs case, which allowed funding to go into the independent religious schools. However, in faith-based higher education, funding from government is almost non-existent in comparison. We have these things called Commonwealth-supported places, which is student subsidy for their degree. They handed out a handful to faith-based higher education institutions, a few of them back in 2011, and since then there really hasn't been a process for review or any significant addition of Commonwealth-supported places, despite a massive expansion in the sector. So what that means is, if I could put my Alpha Crucis hat on, is Alpha Crucis would be training, and this is last year, was training regional Indigenous teachers out in Wakanya Forbes. And they were paying $60,000 for their degree, and they were not eligible for any Indigenous scholarships or funding because we weren't a university. We weren't on the funding. Whereas if you were doing teacher training in the city in Sydney, you were paying $15,000 for your degree. So 25% of the cost of an Indigenous regional trainee teacher getting trained in an area that is desperate for teachers. This is ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. In our member institutions, our PhD students will, over the course of their degree, pay $100,000 more, or through loss of scholarships or subsidies for living, $100,000 more than a student at a public university. Yet, most of our member institutions have quite healthy PhD programs because people are willing to pay because of what we offer, a faith-based PhD program. Most of our members are also not eligible to even apply for research grants with the Australian Research Council. We simply can't apply. And this is particularly hard for those looking to become a university, because the research standard for becoming a university is now been raised even higher, but you actually can't get any funding for research until you become a university. You see the challenge in the sector here? So there is huge problems restricting industry, yet despite the massive equity issues in faith-based higher education, our institutions are at the forefront of contributions across education, health, social service, and aged care. The recent 2022 QUILT indicators, that's the quality indicators for learning and teaching data, show that out of the top 14 higher educational institutions ranked for student satisfaction, 12 were faith-based and independent institutions. 12 of the top 14, with that funding disparity. Our students are also more likely to be first in family to go to university, to be engaged in volunteer work, to go into service-orientated careers. Yet despite all this, the faith-based higher education sector continues to be dangerously underfunded, underutilised, and forgotten. So what has all this got to do with religious freedom? Well, firstly, it's important to recognise there are unique challenges that higher education face, which have significant consequences for the Christian church. This perennially forgotten sector shows actually that, with a quick survey of international cases, is usually first in line when it comes to cases around religious freedom. A huge amount of cases involve higher education institutions. Let me provide just a quick sample of the last 10 years internationally, and a couple from Australia. So Fernandez Martinez v. Spain in 2014, a Catholic education institution in Spain declined to renew an employment contract with one of its teachers because he joined a public campaign against church doctrine. The teacher sued, arguing that ending his contract based on his expression violated his personal autonomy rights. After he lost in the Spanish courts, he sued Spain at the European Court of Human Rights. On June 12, 2014, the court ruled 9-8 in favour of Spain, holding that Spain was right to protect the ability of the church to select its own religious teachers and professors, free from government interference. 2014 in the US, Gordon College versus the New England Association of Schools and Colleges. And this relates to your letter signing one as well, Peter. In 2014, the president of Gordon College, Michael Lindsay, in his personal capacity, signed a letter to President Obama around his proposed changes to the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which asked for an exemption for religious institutions contracting with the federal government. Just 8 days after he signed the letter, the city of Salem, where they were based, suspended a long-term contract with Gordon College that had allowed the college to use the city-owned town hall. Then in August, a nearby school district ended an 11-year relationship with the school and refused to accept Gordon College's students as student teachers in their system. Not long after, the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, which is the accreditation body for the college, announced that Gordon College's traditional views violated the association's standards for accreditation. Eventually, after a deeply damaging media campaign, the accrediting association did bend the knee and re-accredited Gordon College after being threatened with federal action. In 2018, Trinity Western University v. the Law Society of Upper Canada. This evangelical tertiary institution in British Columbia, Canada, had in place a staff and student community covenantal agreement, which undertook, among other things, that students would not engage while studying at TWU in sexual intimacy that violates the sacredness of marriage between a man and a woman. 2 Canadian provincial law societies decided not to authorise the graduates of the recognised and accredited legal degrees from TWU, so they weren't able to practice in the provinces due to the college's covenant, claiming they imposed a harm on LGBTI students. The Supreme Court sided with the law societies in a 7-2 decision, despite TWU winning a similar challenge 8-1 on accreditation of their teachers back in 2001. Dissenting judges noted they believed there was a serious impairment on the religious freedom of TWU. 2019, Felix Ngole versus University of Sheffield. In 2016, Felix Ngole was expelled from his social work course at the University of Sheffield after quoting Bible verses on Facebook that were deemed critical of homosexuality. In 2019, the UK Court of Appeal overturned a UK High Court decision to uphold Felix's expulsion from Sheffield, reinforcing that people of faith have the legal right to express the biblical views in public without fear for their professional careers. 2019, in Monash University, Rabbi Dr. Shimon Cohen, his honorary status was revoked by Monash University after he published a comprehensive briefing on same-sex marriage from the standpoint of the Judeo-Christian tradition. This was without formal warning or any opportunity being given to Rabbi Cohen to address the complaint or defend his work. 2021, InterVarsity versus Wayne State, a US district court ruled that Wayne State University violated the First Amendment with a 2017 decision that temporarily denied InterVarsity Christian Fellowship its status as a student group over the chapter's requirements that its leaders actually be Christian. 2022, back to Gordon College. DeWeese Boyd versus Gordon College. This case was brought by a staff member after alleging she was denied full professorship over critiquing the college's policies of traditional sexuality. Gordon argued that staff carried out ministerial functions and thereby under a ministerial exemption. In March 2021, the Massachusetts Supreme Court rejected Gordon College's petition to apply for the ministerial exemption. Last year, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case, but indicated it may return to hear it at a later stage in litigation. Yeshua University, 2022, these are all very recent ones. In 2022, a state trial ordered that the New York Jewish Yeshua University needed to recognize an LGBTQ student group, something the school had refused to do on religious grounds. The Supreme Court, again, declined and sent the Orthodox Jewish University back to the state court with specific instructions, though, on which motions they must file to ask the New York Appeals Court to reconsider the decision against the university, indicating that it may well step in again if the appeals court didn't reconsider. Ozarks College, 2022. A US Court of Appeals ruled that the College of Ozarks, who objected to the legal requirement to let males who identified as females into female-only dorms. Attorneys appealed the decision to the US Supreme Court, but the court decided not to hear the case. The college will therefore have to continue to live it out until the administration decide to start enforcing it against religious colleges. And one that started in 2001, closer to home, is the Vatuvona Seventh-day Adventist College versus Fiji. In 2021, the Court of Appeal overturned a lower court ruling and held that the Seventh-day Adventist College must be able to make decisions about whom to appoint and promote based on merit, not religion. So essentially the government gets to decide who the head of the college or the school is, based on merit, not religion. On October 27th, 2023, less than 10 days ago, the Fiji Supreme Court upheld the power of the government that religious educational institutions that receive public money may not limit hiring and promotions to members of their own faith. To me, that one invokes the 15th, 16th century debates around who can appoint bishops in England. So what this rapid summary demonstrates is that there are unique challenges facing people of faith and institutions of faith in higher education. Everything from the freedom to employ academics who uphold the faith in private institutions, the use of public buildings, graduate student placements in hospitals and schools, the recognition of their graduates by authorizing institutions such as law and counseling, the accreditation which authorizes educational degrees, the ability of students to express personal views on marriage in public universities, the ability of academics to express personal views on marriage in public universities, the ability of faith-based student groups to select leaders who uphold their values in public universities, the ability to deny certain student groups opposed to religious values in religious educational institutions, the ability to restrict female dorms to females, and the ability to select heads of institutions with a relevant faith background rather than a government-derived merit system. So higher education is deep in the trenches And any change from the roots of the educational tree has a lasting impact not only on the rest of education, but on every single career pathway branch that requires education and training. So that's the first point, that we have unique challenges. The second point is that faith-based higher education provides avenues into current government narratives and social engagement. Last Monday, we held the first inaugural Faith-Based Higher Education Summit in Parliament. It was sponsored by the Minister for Education, Jason, and we invited in all of the different faith groups who are seeking higher education pathways. Sheikh Shadi, he's the president of the Imams Council, he was instrumental in helping us do this because in Australia, we don't train imams. We don't train rabbis. We don't train Hindu priests. And this is an issue. You ask any Australian whether they prefer to be getting community leaders from overseas who sometimes don't understand the language very well, certainly don't understand the Australian culture, or you'd rather have them trained here by faith-based institutions, you're going to get a pretty positive response. So it was an opportunity to recognise that the government, particularly in Western Sydney, is very engaged in minority faith pathways, and we provide, as being in the industry for a bit longer, the facilitation and support for religious freedom and these minority faiths to be able to forge and have their own communities. And what's good for them is certainly good for us in this current climate. That's the first narrative. The second narrative is around the Pacific. There's two things that Australia has that China doesn't, and that's faith and football. But when it comes to higher education, we don't, because of the small sector here in Australia, all of the Pacific Islanders, and in Indonesia, counting the 90% Muslims in Indonesia, South Korea even, they're all going to the US for their faith-based higher education. They would much prefer to be coming here because they do want a faith-infused education. If we're to engage in the Pacific, this is a really key pathway to engage with, and the support that's needed in the Pacific to lift the educational standards is massive. There are, again, putting on my Pentecostal Alpha Crucis hat, there are 125 million Pentecostals and Charismatics in Southeast Asia alone, and no Pentecostal university. It's probably not too much different for the Anglicans, Baptists, and Presbyterians as well. Lastly, the third narrative is social service and charity reliance. 50 to 60% of social services and 80 to 90% of charity work in Australia, on top of the 35% of education, is faith-based. It is our institutions that train the chaplains, the counsellors, the teachers, the youth workers, the pastors, the nurses, the social workers, the childcare workers. And this is a massive amount of volunteer, social and relational capital. The current Charities Minister, Andrew Lee, has a significant interest in how we measure this capital. The language that we use in social service and charities, where they're mostly caught up in measuring economic standards, needs to change. That we as Christians and people of faith understand that relational capital is the key metric that things should be measured by. But we haven't got the research to back that up. We need faith-based higher education to be involved in that. So my second point was around that we can engage in these narratives that government are interested in. Pacific, minority faiths, and social capital. Lastly, my last point, and Mike's giving me the eye, so I will go through this one quickly, but the creative, academic and relational capital provided by innovators in faith-based higher education can provide alternative pathways to religious freedom. Let me just share one fascinating, in the last 5 years I've been working in this space, one fascinating policy change that has occurred. There is a massive teacher training crisis at the moment in this country. We've had about 20 reviews. They don't know how to solve it. They do more reviews and then nothing changes, and the problem has gotten worse and worse and worse. Some of the faith-based higher education institutions has developed a new model of education. At Alpha Crucis, we call it the hub model. At Morling and CHC, they call it the embedded teacher model, but it's all very similar. And essentially, instead of someone from Wakanya Forbes needing to come into Sydney to become a teacher, leaving their community, often returning after a few weeks or never returning, we get a cluster of schools together, and we say, if we partner with you, you can train your own teachers in your schools on site for the entire 4-year degree, same degree, but you can do it where you are, where you live, on country, for country. You're in front of the classroom on day one. You're working a couple of days a week as a teaching assistant. You're being closely mentored and engaged in these community partnerships. Now, this pilot was launched in 2017. The hub model is now in over 50 schools nationwide, and if you include the other institutions with similar models, it's probably over 100. Now, do you see the link to religious freedom here? Just have a think for a second. If one of the main issues is getting staff that share your religious ethos and being concerned about discriminating if people come in and apply for a teaching role, if that's a real concern and that's where most of the religious freedom issues come up, well, if you create your own HR pipeline with a mini university within your school cluster, and you're carefully selecting who goes into that program, then working closely with them over 4 years, embedding them into your ethos and your culture, and then plugging them into your staffing gaps without having to resort to the lucky dip of public university graduates, you're not going to have issues with staff upholding your ethos. You've just had a 4-year job interview of students who are ready to go straight away. It's a creative alternative to religious freedom, especially if the board turns black, as Monica demonstrated earlier, then you have to find alternative ways to deal with this. And this is one example of how it can be done through creative thinking, partnerships with higher education through schools. The church has been on the defensive for the last 20 years in regard to policy. Now, I think that's tremendously important. These battles that are being fought are important to defend. But maybe it's time that we got creative once more. There's not a single sphere of society that the church cannot make unique and innovative contributions to, based on vibrant biblical principles. I'm talking hospitals, I'm talking business, I'm talking prisons, I'm talking architecture. We've been so caught up in being concerned about things sliding that I think we've lost the opportunities. One example I want to bring you is that my wife studied medicine at the ANU. I'm just gloating about that generally. I bring it up whenever I can. But the ANU has muted the idea that abortion practices should be compulsory in the program. You have to participate in one before you can complete your degree. Now, I don't think that's been put in place yet officially, but that's where it's heading. And that will mean that many people of faith actually will not be able to receive medical degrees. We need medical schools if we want to have Christians engaged in medicine. I'll finish with just an observation that the book, The Benedict Option, was written by Rod Dreher, now probably almost 10 years ago, and was touted as being the most influential religious book of the decade. His thesis was largely around that the water is rising, the flood is coming, and we need to rethink our political and cultural engagement. And he was concerned that a lot of energy was being wasted on focusing on politics. So he proposed that where our focus needs to be is through the creation and building of new institutions, of schools, of employment networks, are really focusing on grassroots church communities. And I think that this is a time where we really need to consider what we can do in that space creatively. One of the things we're hoping to do at Alpha Crucis is develop a new Institute for Christianity and Public Policy to try and stoke some of these ideas and see what we can create. But one thing that Dreyer did say, though, he said that this model of building new things doesn't work without religious freedom. If you're going to pour energy into one political aspect, this is it. Because otherwise we can't have our schools, we can't have our business networks. They'll all be shut down very quickly. So I might finish at that point and apologise for going over time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt.